In my continuing quest to bring visibility to and show my support for libraries, living history museums, and other history resources that make history bigger and more interesting, this week I want to share with you the Her Half of History podcast, written and presented by Lori Davis.
Hi, this is Lori from the Her Half of History podcast. I have always loved history, but it didn't seem to have many women in it. Occasionally, my professors remembered that women existed, but they generally didn't have much to say beyond the position of women? Yeah, not good. Well, it turns out that that's not all there is to say. Humanity has had its ups and downs over the millennia, and women have been there every step of the way, making their contribution. In Her Half of History, I cover women's history in short episodes that fit into a series. Past series topics have included the extraordinary women who seized power, women who escaped slavery, and women in espionage. Since the vast majority of historical women were as ordinary as myself, I also cover what their lives were like, with topics like the history of housework, the history of getting married, and the history of women and their money. So if you ever sat in history class and wondered what the women were doing all that time, check out Her Half of History, available at herhalfofhistory.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Episode 86, 18th Century Transportation, Its Role in the Economic Destinies of the Colonies, Part 1. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the main modes of transportation in the 18th century colonies and how they are indicators of, if not causes, of the widely different economic development of the colonies. This is absolutely the correlation is not causation episode. But the movement of foodstuffs, what was moved, who used them, and what was expanded or not was definitely entangled in the developing food cultures and economic destinies of the 18th century colonies. And this is another big topic that turns into a two-parter. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that in our oldest big cities, transportation by water was the most popular way to get large amounts of stuff around. With no trains, no cargo planes, no 18-wheeler trucks, and all motion being directly tied to a person or a draft animal that had to be fed with food you had to grow, the desire to find the lowest horsepower or ox or mule power way to move stuff was much more central to food logistics than it is now. And most of the time, while slower, water transport was preferred. Some things couldn't be moved by water, and sometimes there was profit to be made from moving stuff faster, so roads were coming into use, but not in the same ways everywhere. But if there was one way all the 18th century British colonial centers were the same, and this was true all over the globe, they faced the ocean around an excellent harbor. This made sense since the point of colonies was to mine the rest of the globe for raw materials that could be shipped back to the mother city to either feed the populace or to make into products that could be sold at home and abroad. Cotton and indigo, rice, tobacco, saltpeter, wheat, salt fish, salt pork, salt beef, iron, timber, charcoal, captives to be turned into slaves, whale oil, sugar, tea, citrus fruits, and spices were tops among the items London was directing about the globe and raking in the profits at home. Sure, some of these things happened right on shore, like salting fish and shipbuilding, but most of them had to happen a bit inland, and that's where the roads came in. Different colonies were formed with different goals and developed along different philosophical lines. They also were built in different climate zones and had different looking landscapes. That meant that the colonial cities ended up building lots of different transport schemes. While there's much to be said about the road networks of, say, West Africa, the Caribbean, India, and the Chinese outposts, that is far beyond my area of study. So I'll leave that up to other people. I'm focused locally, or at least within my particular country of study. In my recent trip to Philadelphia and environs, the layout of cities and the development of roads, when viewed through my current lens of historical food logistics, well, I ended up with a different view of why East Coast transportation systems look like they do. and some of the reasons why they are markedly different from the new cities of the far west and the west coast that I'm most familiar with, as well as the middle-aged cities of the middle of the country, which are different all over again. The very fact that modern America has had a movement to rediscover local foods, and we are fascinated by the ideas of farm to fork and locally grown, shows how much of American history turns out to be tied up with the transport of foodstuffs away from where they are grown, for exploration, for war, for profits, and development of the land. So water. Every early big city was situated around an easy way to send boats back to England. Jamestown stuck out there on a nubbin in the wide mouth of the James River, and Boston, which quickly replaced Plymouth, with its harbor full of islands that were handy for defense, are prime examples of this. But wait, there's more. So much more. So I'm going to do a quick rundown of the major cities of the 18th century colonies and how they faced back out towards the world. New Netherland, captured and renamed New York, started big and would soon, but not yet, be the biggest. Norfolk, Virginia, and Baltimore, Maryland, on opposite ends of the Chesapeake Bay, and then Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware, along the Delaware River, were all big shipping towns. Newport, Rhode Island, and New Haven, Connecticut, both saw similar traffic to Boston in these early days. Nothing much went on in North Carolina. The shifting waterways between its sandy barrier islands that make up the Outer Banks along most of its coastline made it unappealing as a port for large commercial ventures, which also made it a favorite spot for illegal activity. Inland, it was between prosperous Virginia and South Carolina. As kind of nowhere, it was becoming a haven for later foreign Protestant weirdos and others who mostly wanted to be left alone for one reason or another. That, combined with the Outer Banks growing as a preferred destination for pirates and smugglers and everyone in between, the conditions were not encouraging towards the setting up of any sort of major port. The closest North Carolina came was in Wilmington at the end of the Cape Fear River. But it was practically in South Carolina, and come on, Cape Fear? That was not a town that was ever going to be the most popular, since even though there was a river delta to sail up, it was a sandy, shifty, messy, and dangerous one, and thus really more suited to the smugglers and pirates who craved tricky navigation that required local knowledge. There were few globally positioned commercial folks who looked for straightforward and reliable conditions that really wanted to brave those conditions. Straightforward and reliable could be found by the planters who had been pushed out of Barbados or wanted to expand their operations in Charleston, South Carolina. While Georgia had begun life as sort of a penal colony and rehabilitation farm experiment station, once the money to be made from rice was made clear, the harbor at Savannah became world-facing. And that was the last big city of the 18th century British North American colonies. For south of that were Spanish and French lands, so currently no concern of mine. Each of these port cities, and honestly that's the only sort of large city there was in the 18th century colonies, while they all faced back into the wide world, they each did so on their own terms. They got their export goods from different sources and sent them to different places. And the things and the people they tended to import were different as well, both in where they came from and how they were distributed inland. It is from these colonial starting points, philosophical, geographical, and climatic, that the economic destinies of these future states would be shaped. The transport networks out into the world, but also internally, are all part of this shaping. I'm not here to say that the way water was used and roads were formed caused these fates, or that the fates caused roads of one sort or another. That's what I meant by correlation isn't causation. I'm not claiming directionality here. Rather, this is just documentation. These states turned out quite differently in how they made and used roads and moved food around. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to be considered there. So, let's start up in Boston and work our way down to Savannah and see how transportation of foodstuffs and related products along roads and waterways was developing, and where these colonies were headed economically. But first, A little geography. The east coast of North America is old. Not quite Australia old, where some surfaces had been facing out for about 3 billion years, but the surface of the American East Coast has been facing the sun and the elements for a long time, around 300 million years. The east coast of North America used to touch West Africa and kissed Europe in the good old Pangea days. In a series of very slow and occasionally reversing drifts, these continents have been pushed apart to their current positions by a rift that runs down the center of the Atlantic Ocean. The actual vent can be visited in the ocean off Iceland. That's why Iceland interferes with air traffic occasionally. The seam that is pushing the world apart and the volcanic activity, it's letting off some extra pressure. But you say, since we're living on a globe, if the world is being pushed apart, isn't it being smushed together somewhere else? Yes it is. Over on the other side of North America, on the Pacific side, there are all sorts of places that are subduction zones. That is, one plate of the earth is being covered over by another. This makes for all sorts of fun earthquakes and volcanoes over there, which also makes for younger, taller, sharper mountains and more areas of bare rock, shallow dirt, and generally younger surfaces. There's just a lot more going on there tectonically. But this is a useful oversimplification that explains why on the east side of the continent the surface is of similar age to Europe and West Africa, and so is recognizable in some ways, plants, soil types, land formations, to people arriving from over the Atlantic Ocean, voluntarily or not. But the west side of the Rocky Mountains, that crumple zone of the continent, is more alien, sharper, and wilder seeming in its relative geologic youth. So even though the weather patterns were often confounding, the landscape, how steep waterfalls were, what tree types generally were to be found, were strange, but not super weird to the people coming across the Atlantic. Not Australia, India, or Galapagos Islands weird, anyway. And so to these people, Boston looked like a great place to head for. Comfortably south of London, it surely would have an even better agricultural climate than the home isle. Not understanding the Coriolis effect or atmospheric rivers, the English assumptions turned out to be badly off, and Boston and its surrounds turned out to be pretty marginal for farming. Sure, people could grow enough to feed themselves and their farms, but never enough grain of any sort to export. But while the area, except for a few warm spots, was a complete bust when it came to growing grain, it turned out to be unparalleled for growing the tall, straight, springy trees needed for ship masts, and then plenty of timber for other ship parts, as well as charcoal to spare. And the coastline was practically clogged with cod and other tasty fish. And that is what Boston became known for. That and all the boats that were built there. The people who originally settled there never had any designs on great fortunes tied to vast tracts of farming land. Rather, villages made of tight-knit families was the goal. In order to connect these villages and exchange ideas, goods, and services, roads were important. So while all roads led to Boston Harbor and were often clogged up with logs and other timber products for the ships and barrels that came out of there, the landscape around was also crisscrossed with the local commerce of the area. Small, partly self-sufficient farms depended on interconnected networks of materials and skills, so internal commerce grew up to support the global commerce of fish, timber, and boatworks. The Atlantic currents facilitated the shipping of that salt fish to the Caribbean to feed the enslaved people working coffee and sugar plantations, and then the return of sugar and molasses for cookery and making rum. From the start, roads between places were important outside Boston. The climate, the soil, and the philosophy of the earliest colonists meant that farms stayed small, so just about everyone traded a bit with everyone else to get everything they needed. Food was mostly traded internally, and cash cropping of food products for export were rare. The relatively low value of the exports, fish, timber, and ship labor, meant innovation was valued. Wealth from being clever was possible, so literacy and education were spread relatively widely among the population, especially compared to similar populations in Britain. River transport was used, but most waterways were narrow and steep. They made for better mill races for sawmills and grist or grain mills, and power to drive trip hammers at iron furnaces than they did for transport. So much of New England, the northern colonies, were crisscrossed with roads. And because farms and villages were smaller, that is, there weren't any enormous estates, road upkeep was a community effort. Thus the scheme of toll roads and paid ferries across rivers existed. Before federally funded roads, a community scheme to have a good, fast road, toll roads, was a way to get and keep good roads. So yes, the Massachusetts Turnpike and its tolls go far, far, far back into the beginnings of our history. In fact, terrain funnels just about everything east of the Green Mountains, the western borders of Massachusetts and Vermont, into Boston Harbor and Newport, Rhode Island. And there's no real reason that Boston Harbor couldn't have been the only port in that area except Massachusetts, Connecticut, and points north, well, they were a bit prickly about who was in and who was out. While much of the population was made up of foreign Protestant weirdos. Even for them, some weirdos were too much. Quakers and their ilk were pretty bad. But of course, the worst of the worst were to be found within one's own small sect. Someone who had slight theological quibbles. So this left Boston to be the third largest colonial city. And a new base was formed, Rhode Island, and thus the bustling port of Newport, which ended up being the fifth largest colonial city. While Boston would continue to be the port of call for timber products, Newport became the northern center for just sheer commerce. South of the Hook of Nantucket, it cut off time in shipping, so became a popular location for transshipment, where transatlantic cargoes were broken up for more local delivery to the myriad coastal and river towns along the northern coast. As a city of commerce first, Newport again had no need for large agricultural estates. Farming was better than in much of Massachusetts, but it still suffered from the same rocky, thin soil, so again, foodstuffs were not typically exported. Rather, as an exchange point, it was a location where luxuries could be found and traded. So just like Boston, Rhode Island would be crisscrossed with roads connecting villages of families. But all the roads tended to hug the water. Unlike in Massachusetts, the residents of Rhode Island had little motivation to stray far from its miles of well-protected shores. The waterways from Providence to Newport would also be constantly crisscrossed with small craft, as the water provided far cheaper and lower energy transport for moving goods around. With religion as its founding point, literacy was valued here too. And once the original prickliness of its founders had been sanded down by monetary success, the initial independence of the founders was combined with a similar acceptance of cleverness. So by the 18th century, it was sort of, don't get too friendly, but sure, we'll talk great books and maybe write some of our own. Things were a bit different in New York. With the Green Mountains cutting things off to the east and the Hudson River shooting straight north, this was a port that had access to many things. Since the island of Manhattan had started off its European life as New Amsterdam in New Netherland, it had been dedicated to small farms that were there to support colonial ventures in wood, furs, and any other possible riches of the wilderness to the north. Large land holdings were not the goal, and initially, neither were food or grain exports. Getting wood, charcoal, and furs from the far north, and deer hides from closer in, became the first riches. The island of Manhattan made a great point of export. The ability to have many piers meant the island again was crisscrossed with roads, from port to warehouse to trading office and the farms that were close to the shore. The Hudson River that went north, though it sprouted many spurs to Dutch farms and later plenty to English and other nationalities that found places along the river, the furthest practical end of the Hudson is where the town of Albany grew. This area was already recognized as handy for connecting the interior of the area to the coast by the Mohicans before the Dutch showed up and started planting forts. And the English were perfectly happy to move in 1686 when they took over the colony. Incidentally, despite all the groundwork the Dutch had put in, They were happy to trade this rustic backwater for the far more promising-looking Suriname along the North Atlantic coast of South America. Seriously, I'm getting so fascinated by Suriname. I may end up doing a little mini-series on it. We never hear anything about it now, but it's bundled in with the American story in so many ways. The agricultural head start the Dutch had given the colony did lead to it being a wheat exporter at times, especially to other parts of North America and the Caribbean, and later, once the Erie Canal opens up, to many parts of the world. New York, as the second largest colonial city, was the furthest northerly port that exported an agricultural cash crop, that is, the wheat, but it also acted to funnel out the riches of Canada to England, to Europe, and many other parts of the world. The quirk of the ocean currents and the navigation habits of the period that connected it to Madagascar would also make it a global port and stopping point for pirates. Water moved goods both into and out of the city, but the city itself made use of many roads. The Dutch merchant background of the city, along with it attracting and accepting religions, languages, and monies from around the world, meant that it was as much a center of learning and culture as it was of money. So education, innovation, and travel were always part of the fabric of the city. The Delaware River hosts the next two major cities, Wilmington and Philadelphia. The area around Wilmington was originally host to colonial efforts by Sweden. Remnants of that effort are still to be found along the banks of the Delaware and in Philadelphia itself. The funny little semicircle that chops off a piece of Pennsylvania and makes it a new state, along with a part of the peninsula that divides the Chesapeake Bay from the Atlantic, is all due to fights back in England between different people who were friends and enemies of Charles II and his queen Catherine of Braganza, or James II and his wives Anne and Mary, or Mary II and William of Orange. It was all petty and complicated and arbitrary. In the end, New Sweden got subsumed into the British colonies, and Philadelphia became by far the bigger port. This was largely due to the iron and later wheat industries of the Pennsylvania countryside. Wilmington, as more of a port of pure commerce, was swamped in popularity by Newport as a place for transshipment. The welcoming attitude and knack for harmony of the Pennsylvania colony made it a favored destination for all sorts of farmers coming from the warring Prussian and German states. The rich iron ore and rich soil made sure there was plenty of stuff to export. The Brandywine, Schuylkill, and Delaware rivers meant there was plenty of water power to drive iron and flour milling, and water transportation to feed a robust exchange of goods. The fact that the best dirt was well inland of the Philadelphia port drove the desire for roads to bring in the goods for export, as well as to send imported goods inland to be bought by the farmers making good money on their products. Pennsylvania turned out to be the Goldilocks of the 13 colonies. Not too hot, not too cold, not steep at all, and the rivers were cooperative for power and transport. The trees were cooperative for charcoal for different industries. Transport would be divided between roads and rivers, and early turnpikes, toll roads, and ferries would also crop up as transportation to the port was important, but internal commerce was deemed important as well. All of these elements together conspired to make Philadelphia the largest colonial city, which is why it was the first continental capital. Larger tracts of land were purchased and granted than had been typical further north, but again, the mixed goals of the settlers and an inclination to religious observance and the building of associated communities meant that regular communication and commerce, education, and cleverness were all valued. So travel and transport was something more of everyone did compared to everyone back in England. And Penn's fuzzy but generally admirable vision of lots of people doing lots of good in lots of places and doing lots of business with lots of other people led to his woods being drawn over with roads connecting lots of places. The colonies from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, while rather different from each other, all had in common some sort of ideal of giving all men, more or less, who arrived some sort of chance to expand to his largest, best self. Yes, There was a caste system, but the labor shortage was so acute that the worst of the early religious squabbles cooled off, and commerce with the world and commerce with the surrounding countryside became much more valuable. In all of these places, the big roads led to the big port, but plenty of roads led within and were, for the day, well traveled. Things look a little different south of the Mason-Dixon line. Wait, you ask, isn't Mason-Dixon something to do with the Civil War? Yes it is. That's the period where it's most frequently spoken of, but it was surveyed between 1763 and 1767 as a way to clear up messy grantings of Pennsylvania to William Penn by Charles II and Maryland to Lord Baltimore by King Charles I. Look, neither of those guys had ever been to North America, and they had just sort of vaguely waved their hands in the general direction of New Jersey and granted them land somewhere behind that. Some of it northish of Trenton and some of it southish of Trenton. Okay, mostly joking. There was no Trenton at this point, but the grants were vague, and Penn and Baltimore's descendants were getting sniffy at each other, and George III was just completely over their squabbling. Or maybe it was George II that was over their carping and had this survey and subsequent line drawing set in motion before he died in 1760. These things take time, you know. But anyway, while most of the land in the colonies north of this line had largely been taken, granted, and purchased by individuals of non or barely noble status, and generally by people of small fortunes or practically no fortunes at all, things were mostly quite different to the south. And that is what I will talk about next week. Who owned most of the land? What major port cities concentrated on, or why there were no huge port cities? And what the transport tendencies of those regions were. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles along with your favorite local history expanding resources you'd like me to mention will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. It's also time to start thinking up questions for my end of season 2 question show, which is coming up here in about 3 more topics, so probably 4 more episodes, unless I accidentally end up with another 2-part topic again. Anyway, I look forward to answering questions or going a little deeper into something I brushed by quickly. My bibliography and show notes, up to a point, are at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes and other ways to send me questions are also in the show's Twitter, Insta, and post.news bios at THOA Food and in the show description.